Hello, this is Lauren O'Brien. I'm Chief Revenue Officer of Cloudastructure. Welcome to AI Perimeter. I am here with James McCormack, our CEO, and Greg Smitherman, our CFO. And we have a special guest today. Joining us today is John Tinkham of AGC Partners, one of the most active investment banking firms in the country, and also a firm that has really studied the remote monitoring business. And John sits at a fascinating intersection. He has seen dozens of remote monitoring companies and surveillance companies, for that matter, over the course of the years. And he has a really unique perspective on the market that he is going to share with all of you today. So we're super excited. Thank you so much for joining us today, John. So before we get started, you've been, as I mentioned, deeply involved in remote monitoring. Before we get into specifics, what's your overall read on the market?
Yeah, I think taking a step back and just looking at physical security technology more broadly, it's absolutely having a moment. And I think, you start to unpack why that is. First and foremost, I think from a macro environment, there's a lot of scary events that have happened over the last, 2, 3, 4 years that, get a lot of media attention, whether it's the prevalence of school shootings, what happened with Blackstone, United Health, right? The assassination attempt on President Trump. Again, the perception is that it's a scary world. And so, I think with that, some of the violence and some of those scary things are happening in settings that are relatively new, whether it's healthcare, corporate. These are very large markets that all of a sudden are rapidly expanding the budget to defend against those types of events, and naturally, those budgets shift to technology where, there's the largest opportunity to have, an immediate impact. And so you've got this burgeoning demand for new technology. At the same time, the existing landscape of technology, maybe the most installed technology, if you will, some of that has been relatively antiquated. And so there's, this opportunity for, more next generation technology, in particular, in the age of artificial intelligence, to really take market share away from, some relatively antiquated solutions, and certainly in remote monitoring. And so, yeah, there's just, that combination of demand and opportunity for tech to make a difference and to replace antiquated solutions. I think, it's sort of the perfect, opportunity and for someone like a growth equity firm or a venture capital firm or, a public market investor. You're kind of looking at where the puck is going from a demand standpoint, and that's where a lot of the interest is coming from.
Yeah, we're seeing at Cloudastructure, as an example, 3 years ago, our remote monitoring contracts were about 30% of our business, and now it's about 100%. So almost every single one of our contracts includes remote monitoring due to the power and also the public safety issues. We, as a group, have read your report, and we have a lot of questions for you. And James is going to kick us off with a few.
Yep. So, John, one of the takeaways from your report that I just found incredibly striking, right, was the bit about the estimate of 1 billion installed surveillance cameras on a worldwide basis and 1.44 trillion minutes of video footage captured on a daily basis, right?
Right.
Those are just absolutely staggering numbers, right? So
Sure.
the question is this. From our perspective, we don't believe that, humans can adequately monitor that 1.44 trillion minutes, right? So do you have a take on maybe what percentage of that footage that's being captured is still being monitored or used for forensic purposes from with human beings as opposed to using artificial intelligence?
It's something around 1, maybe 2% that are actually monitored by humans. And so it's a tiny fraction. I think that the market historically has been very retrospective, right? Something happens, there's a burglary or some other event, and you're reviewing the footage to try to pick up on evidence or otherwise. AI is rapidly changing that. Current estimates are that it's somewhere between sort of like 15 and 25% of cameras today are being monitored in some form by artificial intelligence, and the rate at which that percentage is growing is pretty astronomical for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And so it's a rapidly changing landscape, and it's shifting from this forensic retrospective kind of market to this proactive monitoring that's AI led, and that's the only way when you crunch the numbers. I mean, there's just no other way outside of AI to handle that type of volume.
Mm-hmm. Yep, makes sense. All right, next question. Enterprise businesses are seeing a lot of advantages to remote monitoring. We know this firsthand because that's our business, right? And according to your research, some of the reasons are better incident detection accuracy, operational efficiency, and significant cost savings, over 100%, depending on the application, right?
Sure.
What do you think are the biggest challenges when scaling an AI-based remote monitoring company?
Yeah, I think number one is probably the compute aspect of it, right? So you think about computer, AI for remote monitoring is inherently based around computer vision, and if you're following AI, that's one of the highest compute costs of all different types of AI. Mm-hmm. And so you see companies tackling this a lot of different ways. I'm talking about the vendors that are like yourself providing remote monitoring, AI-enabled remote monitoring, and so there's like a tension. So some companies are trying to do this at the edge, right, on the camera, I guess is the furthest point you can be on the edge. There are advantages there because you're not pushing as much data to the cloud, right, which is where some of those scalability challenges come. But the flip side is that doing things on the edge require more advanced hardware to be installed, which creates its own set of issues, right? You're talking about having to do a hardware refresh cycle for an installation, which is much more time-consuming and challenging to implement than, say, implementing software that's camera or infrastructure agnostic, right? On the other side, there's companies that exclusively use the cloud and push connected camera data up into the cloud and then do all of the compute in the cloud. Well, the challenge there is just that creates a scalability issue in terms of how much it costs to process all that data, apply AI to that data if it's exclusively in the cloud. And then there's a lot of companies that are doing something in the middle, right, where maybe they put a server on site or a high-end computer. I've heard of some companies using Macintosh computers. There's various kind of meet in the middle approaches where you're processing some portion of the data on site and then some portion of it gets pushed to the cloud. But it's interesting, and different end markets have different unique needs and different existing camera infrastructures. And so there's a lot of opportunities for more than one sort of winner, if you will, in this space, because different environments have different requirements and just cater better to different models. And so, it's there are some challenges, but I think that's probably number one.
Okay, great, thank you. Last question for me right now, John, is what are you seeing from end user markets that are adopting technologies, right? Like, remote monitoring, right? Are there particular verticals? We have our own take, right? But we're just curious what you think from a vertical or end user standpoint.
Yeah, I think probably the three I would highlight would be multifamily, healthcare, and corporate, and they're all kind of getting pushed from different demand reasons, like healthcare. Nurse safety as an example has become a huge flashpoint. In multifamily, I think just the perception of crime rates and concerns again, about protecting your home from a consumer standpoint, have made companies that are either owning and operating multifamily real estate or a similar model. It's all of a sudden like a big perk, right? If you have differentiated kind of security posture as a multifamily company, and then corporate, again, just in light of what happened with United, what happened with Blackstone recently, I think there's a lot of board level discussions about how can we keep our employees safe. And so those would be the three that I would highlight. Great, thank you.
All right, my turn. So your report highlighted a significant amount of M&A activity, about 21.3% annual growth. What's driving that consolidation? And you do touch on who do you think are the acquirers versus those that are best suited to be acquired?
Yeah, I think the consolidation part of it is you've got either very well-funded private equity-backed companies, think of private companies like Mercata, or some very well-capitalized publics, right, that are trying to stay on the cutting edge of what is a kind of dynamic and rapidly evolving space. And again, you've a space that overall is growing very quickly, as compared to some other segments of the technology market. And so, it kind of ties back to something we were talking about earlier, but like there's just like the market is ripe for the money to be put to work. And so I think you're just seeing some of those large players get pretty aggressive when it comes to staying on the cutting edge from a technology standpoint. There's also the opportunity to buy your way into new markets, either new end markets, right, or if maybe you have a strength in education and you want to get into healthcare, or new markets in the sense of like new product offerings. So you might be an access control company historically that is all of a sudden interested in getting into remote monitoring. The Brevo Eagle Eye merger comes to mind through that lens. So I think there's a lot of companies getting pretty aggressive. Uniquely to this market, it's a lot of the publics are some of the most active acquirers, right? Names like Motorola Solutions have bought some astronomical number of companies in the last 5 years, Assa Abloy, and several others. A lot of M&A over the last 5 years has been driven, taking a step back more broadly from a technology standpoint, by private equity backed companies, right? Because the private equity firms are sort of desperate, if you will, to put their capital to work. But in this industry, uniquely, a lot of the public strategics are more active, and I think that's a benefit, right? Because the public strategics are typically a bit larger and can stretch on value when they need to.
Okay, Greg, we're going to move over to you.
All right, sounds great, John. Just really happy to have you here. Want to focus a little bit on your view of how fundamental and how quickly the changes AI are having on remote monitoring and remote guarding. What kind of fundamentals? Obviously, it's already having some impact. How quickly do you see it having more of an impact? How fundamental do you think that impact is going to be in terms of driving profitability and scalability?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that, despite some of the scalability challenges I mentioned, AI can be very effective. AI is sort of always on, and AI is generally going to be a lot cheaper than a physical guard or a individual watching a screen in a SOC somewhere. And so, yeah, it's changing rapidly, and the potential for AI in this space is especially strong. and so yeah, I think it's shifting. It's shifting quickly. There are certainly environments where physical guards or individuals are always going to, I think, be needed and be a big part of it. You think of like a TSA line, right? You never really that's a dynamic situation where you could never really envisioned humans being taken out of the loop, at least in the near to medium term. But it's certainly AI is certainly a big disruptor here, and probably more so than other industries.
Okay.
Well, we have several other questions for you, but we are out of time. So we'll have to have you back, John. This has been very informative. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks to the team here. Follow us at AI Perimeter. And if you have any questions, it's AIP@cloudastructure.com. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, John.